That's a lot of car for a Tuesday afternoon. You got paperwork for this fall off a transport truck during lunch.
It's my vehicle, officer. I'm just heading back to the office.
Your vehicle? What do you do? Sell supplements? Rap? Because a suit that white doesn't stay clean on the street during a workday?
I'm a federal prosecutor, Department of Justice.
A Fed? Right. And I'm the chief of police.
If you'd like to see my credentials, they are in my jacket pocket.
Hands where I can see them. Don't move toward your pocket.
Unless you want to spend the rest of this sunny afternoon in a different kind of suit.
The body camera footage clicked on at 2:12 p.m. on a bright Tuesday. What it recorded in the next 12 minutes of broad daylight would eventually result in a $7 million settlement, the largest of its kind in the city's history. A black man in a custom-tailored white wool suit stood at Pump 4, fueling a dark midnight blue luxury coupe under the harsh afternoon sun. He was Tommy Dixon, and he had spent the last decade putting cartel leaders and corrupt officials in federal prison. He was used to being the most powerful person in the room, but on this humid afternoon under the glare of the midday sky, none of that mattered. To Officer Lewis James Cannon, Tommy wasn't a representative of the U.S. government. He was just a profile that didn't fit the zip code during business hours. Before we break down the moment this officer's career ended in the light of day, where are you tuning in from? Hit that subscribe button below. We expose the footage the precincts try to hide, and your support ensures these stories reach the public eye. The gas station was a high-end stop on the edge of the financial district, the kind of place where the midday sun glints off the chrome of luxury SUVs. Tommy had stopped there after a morning session closing a RICO case that had been 3 years in the making. He was focused, his mind already on the afternoon brief he had to file. He was a man of logic, evidence, and protocol. He expected the world to operate by the rules he spent his life defending, especially in the middle of a busy city. Officer Lewis James Cannon pulled his patrol unit into the lot at 2:11 p.m. His dashcam showed him bypass a group of teenagers loitering near the entrance and a man clearly under the influence near the air pumps. His eyes, and his vehicle, headed straight for the luxury coupe at Pump 4. He didn't run the plates first. He didn't check for a broken taillight. He simply saw the contrast of a black man in a high-stakes suit and a car that cost more than a starter home, and he made a decision while the city watched. The first words captured on the audio weren't a greeting. There was no "Sir, is there a problem?" Cannon's voice was a low, aggressive growl, asking Tommy how he could afford the lifestyle in the middle of a workday. Tommy Dixon looked up, still holding the green nozzle, and in that moment, he realized his professional world and his personal reality were about to collide. He had prosecuted civil rights violations from behind a desk. Now, he was about to become Exhibit A in the bright light of day. As Tommy reached for his wallet, the very movement he was instructed to make, Officer Cannon's hand didn't just hover over his belt, it unholstered his weapon. That split second, captured in high-definition daylight, became the pivot point of the $7 million lawsuit. The image of a federal prosecutor with a gas pump in one hand and his life hanging by a thread while commuters drove by was a visual the city's legal team knew they could never defend. The sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the federal building, illuminating the sharp, pristine lines of Tommy Dixon's white wool suit. It was a bold choice for a man in his position, but Tommy was a man who thrived on precision. If he could keep a high-profile RICO case organized for 3 years, he could certainly keep a suit spotless through a Tuesday morning. He stood at his mahogany desk, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he tucked the final depositions into a thick manila folder. This wasn't just another win. It was the culmination of a decade spent climbing the ranks of the Department of Justice, earning a reputation as a prosecutor who never missed a detail and never broke a sweat. His office was a testament to a life lived by the book. Every award was hung with mathematical symmetry, and every brief was aligned to the edge of the desk. To Tommy, the law was a grand machine, predictable, logical, and blind to anything but the facts. He looked at the clock, 2:10 p.m. He had a 3 p.m. filing across town, a task that required the same meticulous timing he applied to a cross-examination. He grabbed his keys, adjusted his silk tie in the mirror, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew exactly where he stood in the world. He was a protector of the system, a high-ranking official who believed that as long as you followed the rules would follow you. As he walked through the lobby, colleagues nodded in respect. They saw the prestige, the tailored suit, and the dark blue luxury coupe waiting in the parking garage, all symbols of a hard-earned American dream. Tommy wasn't just a lawyer. He was a success story built on the foundation of the very laws he enforced. He headed toward the financial district, the midday light glinting off his windshield, his mind already drifting toward the legal nuances of his afternoon filing. He needed a quick stop for fuel, a simple, 5-minute errand that shouldn't have been anything more than a footnote in his day. He pulled into the Shell station, the bright afternoon sun reflecting off his white sleeve as he reached for the pump, completely unaware that his meticulous world was about to be dismantled by a man who didn't care about his titles or his trophies. The midday heat shimmered off the asphalt as Tommy Dixon guided his luxury coupe toward Pump 4, the engine humming with the same quiet confidence that defined his career. He was tired, the mental weight of the RICO case finally settling into his shoulders, but it was the good kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from knowing you've left no stone unturned. He stepped out into the bright afternoon glare, his white suit jacket unbuttoned just enough to breathe, and reached for the diesel nozzle. The station was busy with the typical lunchtime rush. Commuters moved in a blurred hurry, and the scent of gasoline mixed with the salt of the city air. Tommy focused on the rhythmic click of the pump, checking his watch and calculating the minutes left before his filing was due. He felt untouchable, wrapped in the invisible armor of his status and the high-definition clarity of a successful day. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle at first, a ripple in the peripheral vision of a man used to noticing everything. It began with the slow, deliberate roll of tires on gravel, a sound that didn't match the frantic pace of the other drivers. Then came the shadow. Officer Lewis James Cannon's patrol unit didn't just pull into the station. It loomed, drifting into the frame like a predator that had already spotted its mark from 3 blocks away. The cruiser bypassed the air pumps and the crowded convenience store entrance, its dark windshield fixed on the midnight blue coupe at Pump 4. There was a predatory patience in the way the vehicle slowed to a crawl, the engine growling low as it pulled into a position that effectively boxed Tommy in. Through the tinted glass of the cruiser, Cannon's eyes were locked on the contrast before him. The expensive German engineering, the pristine white wool, and the man who looked like he belonged in a corner office rather than a precinct. Tommy felt the weight of the gaze before he heard the siren's short, aggressive chirp. He didn't look up immediately, his hands remaining steady on the pump, but his internal prosecutor's mind began to race, cataloging the lack of a broken taillight or any erratic driving. As the cruiser door creaked open, the heavy silence of the afternoon was replaced by the ominous jingle of a duty belt. The hunter had arrived, and as Cannon stepped out into the light, he wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for a reason. Officer Cannon didn't start with a greeting or a request for documentation. He led with a sneer, his shadow stretching across the hood of the midnight blue coupe as he closed the distance. He stood with his thumbs hooked into his duty belt, his eyes roaming over the sharp creases of Tommy's white suit with a look that bordered on a challenge. He asked how a young man like Tommy found himself in such a high-performance machine on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice dripping with the kind of coded skepticism that suggested there were only 2 ways a black man could afford such luxury, and neither involved a law degree. He gestured vaguely toward the car, questioning if the registration would actually match the face he was looking at, or if this was just a short-term loan from a friend in a different line of work. Every syllable was a projection, a refusal to see the professional standing before him as anything other than a suspect who had managed to dress up the part. Tommy remained unervingly calm, his grip on the gas nozzle steady as the pump continued to click. He had faced down career criminals and hostile witnesses in the highest courts in the land, and he recognized the officer's tactics for what they were, an attempt to bait him into an emotional reaction that could be categorized as disorderly. He didn't raise his voice or shift his stance. Instead, he met Cannon's gaze with a level of composure that seemed to frustrate the officer even further. He answered the questions with a clinical precision, stating clearly that the vehicle was his and that he was simply fueling up before returning to the federal building. Tommy's calm wasn't just a choice. It was his greatest weapon. He knew the law, and more importantly, he knew that every word Cannon uttered was being etched into the digital memory of a body camera, evidence that would eventually turn this interrogation into a $7 million liability. The officer leaned in closer, his tone hardening as the lack of a proper reaction began to chip away at his authority. He began to ask about supplements and cash on hand, leaning into the tired tropes of the street while standing in the middle of a sun-drenched financial district. He treated the suit not as a sign of success, but as a costume, a white-collar disguise for a blue-collar crime. Tommy watched the officer's hand drift closer to his holster, a move designed to intimidate, but the prosecutor only saw a man digging a hole that no amount of qualified immunity could get him out of. He remained the eye of the storm, a man who understood that while Cannon held the badge today, the law would belong to Tommy tomorrow. The pump clicked off, signaling the end of the transaction, but the tension in the air was only beginning to peak. Tommy Dixon, still maintaining his measured composure, informed Officer Cannon that his credentials, the undeniable proof of his identity as a federal prosecutor, were located in his inside jacket pocket. It was the logical next step in a legal encounter, a move toward transparency and resolution. But Cannon wasn't looking for resolution. He was looking for a threat. As Tommy's hand moved with deliberate slowness toward the lapel of his white suit, the officer's internal narrative of the suspect overrode the reality of the man standing before him. In a violent blur of motion, Cannon screamed a command to freeze, his hand flying to his holster and drawing his duty weapon in the bright afternoon sun. The sight of the barrel leveled at his chest didn't break Tommy's calm, but it did shatter the professional decorum of the scene. Before Tommy could even vocalize a protest, Cannon lunged forward, grabbing the prosecutor by the shoulder of his pristine jacket. With a forceful sweep, the officer drove Tommy toward the oil-stained pavement of the gas station lot. The impact was jarring, the air rushing out of Tommy's lungs as his chest hit the ground. The sharp, white wool of his suit, the symbol of his hard-earned prestige and meticulous life, was instantly ground into the grit, grime, and discarded fuel of Pump 4. Pinned under the officer's knee, Tommy felt the cold bite of steel handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists. The broad daylight that had once illuminated his success now served as a spotlight for his public humiliation. Passers-by slowed their vehicles, cell phones appearing in windows to record the sight of a man in a high-end suit being treated like a violent fugitive. Cannon's breath was hot and triumphant in Tommy's ear as he barked about reaching and resisting, oblivious to the fact that he was currently kneeling on a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a career from a witness stand. As the grit pressed into his cheek, Tommy didn't fight back. He simply looked at the stained sleeve of his ruined suit and realized that the officer hadn't just crossed a line. He had signed away his future for $7 million. The heavy door of the patrol unit slammed shut, sealing Tommy Dixon in a stifling cage of plastic and reinforced glass. Outside, the midday sun continued to beat down on the gas station, indifferent to the career-ending blunder unfolding on the pavement. Officer Cannon, still riding the adrenaline of his aggressive takedown, reached into the pocket of the now-ruined white suit and snatched the leather wallet Tommy had tried to present moments earlier. He didn't bother opening it himself. Instead, he tossed it toward his partner, a younger officer who had been standing guard by the cruiser's hood. Cannon wiped the sweat from his brow and began a loud, boastful commentary for his body camera, justifying the use of force and the suspicious behavior of the man he'd just neutralized. The younger officer caught the wallet and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the identification cards tucked inside. The silence started there. It wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, suffocating withdrawal of sound that seemed to pull the oxygen right out of the humid afternoon air. He looked at the driver's license, then at the heavy brass seal on the second card, and finally at the bold, gold-embossed letters that read, United States Department of Justice, Federal Prosecutor. The partner's face didn't just lose its color. It went a ghostly, translucent pale. He looked up at Cannon, then at the man sitting in the back of the car, and then back at the ID, his hands beginning to tremor. Cannon, noticing the lack of backup for his bravado, demanded to know what the holdup was, his voice still sharp with unearned authority. The The partner didn't answer right away. He just held the ID out at arm's length, as if it were a live grenade. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged whisper that barely registered on the body cam. He read the title aloud, Federal Prosecutor, and the name, Tommy Dixon, a name that had been in the headlines just that morning for the RICO conviction. The effect was instantaneous. Cannon's jaw didn't just drop. His entire posture collapsed as the realization hit him like a physical blow to the gut. The air truly left the room, or in this case, the lot, leaving nothing but the static hum of the precinct radio and the terrifying weight of the mistake they had just handcuffed. The hunter was gone. In his place stood a man who suddenly realized he was the one being scrutinized by the most powerful legal mind in the district. The atmosphere at the precinct was thick with a panicked, corporate desperation that Tommy Dixon found almost offensive in its transparency. Gone was the aggressive bravado of the gas station. In its place was a frantic effort to smooth over a catastrophe that was already etched into digital memory. A high-ranking captain had been called in from his lunch break, offering Tommy a seat in a private office and a cup of lukewarm coffee that went untouched. The handcuffs had been removed with an almost apologetic gentleness, but the damage was already far deeper than the marks on Tommy's wrists. The captain spoke in hushed, conciliatory tones, referring to the assault as a regrettable misunderstanding and an unfortunate lapse in protocol. He offered a formal apology on behalf of the city and a promise of a quiet internal review, suggesting that a simple handshake and a ride back to his car would be the best way for all parties to put the incident behind them. Tommy sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the sleeve of his ruined white suit. The fabric was stained with a dark, oily smudge from the gas station pavement, a permanent blemish on a garment that had been a symbol of his hard-earned prestige. To the captain, it was just a laundry bill. To Tommy, the stain was a metaphor for the way his rights had been trampled under the midday sun. He looked at the officers who had gathered behind the glass of the office door, their faces filled with the uneasy realization that they had targeted the wrong man. The apology being offered wasn't born of genuine remorse, but of a calculated fear of the federal power Tommy represented. He realized that if he accepted this handshake, he would be complicit in a system that only apologized when it accidentally bit someone who could bite back. He stood up, the silence in the room becoming a vacuum that sucked the breath out of the captain's lungs. Tommy didn't reach for the extended hand. Instead, he adjusted his ruined lapel with a chilling, clinical precision. He told the captain that while he appreciated the offer of a ride, he would be calling his own transportation, specifically, a legal team that specialized in civil rights litigation. He made it clear that a quiet internal review would not suffice for a man who spent his life ensuring the law was applied with equity. This was the moment Tommy chose the nuclear option, deciding to trade the convenience of a quick settlement for the public exposure of a federal lawsuit. He walked out of the precinct without looking back, leaving the officers to realize that they hadn't just made a mistake. They had started a war with a man who knew exactly how to win it. The legal machinery began to grind with the same relentless precision Tommy Dixon had once used to topple criminal empires. From his new vantage point as the plaintiff, he watched as his legal team systematically peeled back the layers of a department that had long mistaken silence for safety. What started as a focused inquiry into a single afternoon at a gas station quickly ballooned into an indictment of a culture that protected its own at the expense of the public. As the discovery process unfolded, the paper trail Tommy's team unearthed was more than just a list of administrative errors. It was a roadmap of systemic negligence. They found that Officer Louis James Cannon wasn't a rogue element who had simply had a bad day. He was a repeat offender whose history was littered with similar complaints of racial profiling and excessive force, each one meticulously documented by victims, and each one just as meticulously brushed under the rug by internal affairs. The stack of folders on the conference table grew taller by the day, filled with the voices of citizens who didn't have a federal title or a white wool suit to protect them. There were reports of routine stops that had escalated into violence, and probing questions that had turned into illegal searches, all signed off by a chain of command that viewed Cannon's aggression as proactive policing. For every formal complaint they found, There were 3 more that had been lost in the system or categorized as unfounded, without a single witness being interviewed. Tommy sat at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the data with the cold, analytical gaze of a man who realized he wasn't just suing an officer, but an entire institution. The lawsuit shifted. It was no longer just about the bruised ribs and the stained suit of a federal prosecutor. It was about the custom and practice of a department that had institutionalized bias. By the time Tommy's team was finished connecting the dots, the city wasn't just facing a claim for a wrongful arrest. They were facing a full-scale exposure of departmental failure. The paper trail proved that the city had been warned about Cannon for years, and by doing nothing, they had effectively subsidized his next mistake. As the evidence mounted, the city's legal counsel began to realize that a jury wouldn't just be judging a single cop's hunch. They would be looking at a system that had paved the way for that $7 million disaster. The air in the high-rise mediation suite was far colder than the midday sun that had sparked this crisis. Across the polished glass table, the city's legal defense team sat in a row, their expressions shifting from defensive posturing to a grim, hollow-eyed realization. They had spent weeks reviewing the body camera footage, searching for a single frame of justification, but the data was as unforgiving as the man sitting opposite them. Every time they looked at the recording of Officer Cannon drawing his weapon on a man holding nothing but a gas nozzle, they saw a jury's verdict adding zeros to a check. But the real poison wasn't just the footage, it was Cannon himself. During preliminary questioning, the officer had remained defiant, his testimony riddled with the same coded assumptions and arrogance that had led him to Pump 4. To a jury, he wouldn't just look like a man who made a mistake. He would look like a liability wrapped in a badge. Tommy Dixon sat in silence, his hands folded, watching the city's lead counsel whisper frantically to his aides. The defense knew they had a toxic witness, a man whose history of brushed-aside complaints made him a ticking time bomb on the stand. If this went to trial, Tommy wouldn't just be a victim. He would be a federal prosecutor with 20 years of courtroom experience, dissecting a local cop's prejudice in front of a public gallery and a fleet of news cameras. The spectacle of a high-ranking DOJ official testifying about being ground into the pavement while commuters watched was a PR nightmare the city couldn't survive. They weren't just paying for the ruined suit or the bruised ribs. They were paying to keep the systemic rot of the precinct out of the headlines. The lead negotiator for the city finally cleared his throat, his voice lacking its usual edge. The bravado had vanished, replaced by a desperate need for a signature. They stopped arguing about protocol and started talking about closure. The figure was scrawled onto a piece of paper and slid across the table, $7 million. It was a staggering sum, a number designed to make the lawsuit go away before it could trigger a federal investigation into the entire department. Tommy looked at the number, then at the men who had spent months trying to minimize his humanity. He didn't smile. He knew the money was the only language the city spoke fluently, and by forcing them to pay it, he was finally making them hear the truth of what happened in the bright light of that Tuesday afternoon. He picked up the pen, not because he wanted the wealth, but because he wanted to ensure that Officer Cannon's bias would be the most expensive mistake the city ever made.